In a field in Newark, Ohio, a wall of earth runs in an almost perfect circle more than 1,000 feet across, and beside it, joined by a straight earthen avenue, stands a giant octagon, 8 long walls enclosing ground enough to hold dozens of football fields. They do not look like much at first, low grassy banks a few feet high, but these walls are 2,000 years old. They are the largest geometric earthworks ever built anywhere on Earth, and they were raised by hand by native people long before any European reached the continent. And there is something hidden in their shape, in the way the octagon and the circle are laid out, and the exact directions their walls and openings point. The whole vast structure is aligned to the moon, not to the sun, which is easy, but to the moon, whose full cycle of risings and settings takes more than 18 years to complete. Somebody watched that slow rhythm across a lifetime, worked it out, and built it into the earth on a scale you can only really see from the sky. So who understood the moon that well 2,000 years ago in Ohio, and why has the world so nearly forgotten them that a golf course was built on their work? To follow that question honestly, we have to start with the earthworks themselves, and with the people who moved that much earth by hand. The builders are known to archaeologists as the Hopewell, though that is not a name they called themselves. It comes from the owner of a farm in Ohio where such earthworks were studied, and it is really the label for a whole way of life, a network of communities across the eastern woodlands who, for the first several centuries of the Common Era, roughly 2,000 years ago, shared a remarkable culture of monument building, fine craftsmanship, and long-distance trade. The Hopewell were not a single kingdom or a single tribe. They were a widespread cultural tradition, and the people who took part in it built extraordinary things. They raised geometric enclosures of earth, great circles and squares and octagons laid out with real precision, and they gathered materials from an astonishing range. Copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the southern Appalachians, all of it carried across half a continent and worked into objects of great beauty and buried in their mounds. Their craftsmen cut sheets of mica into the shapes of hands and birds and claws, hammered copper into headdresses and ornaments, and carved little stone pipes into the forms of animals so lifelike they still seem about to move. This was a people of real artistry and reach, not a rough frontier culture, but a sophisticated woodland world with trade routes running to the edges of the continent. And the labor behind the earthworks is almost hard to comprehend. Every one of those long walls was built by carrying earth by the basketful, load after load after load, and heaping and shaping it by hand, without draft animals or metal tools, an effort that must have drawn on many people over many years, and rested on real organization and shared purpose. The Newark Earthworks were their masterpiece. In their original form, before a modern city grew over much of them, the earthworks at Newark sprawled across several square miles, a connected complex of enormous geometric figures joined by walled avenues, the largest set of geometric earthen enclosures known anywhere on Earth. 2 great pieces survive today. One is the Great Circle, an earthen ring more than 1,000 feet across, its walls standing higher than a person in places, with a ditch on the inside. The other is the Octagon, 8 straight walls of earth enclosing an area of about 50 acres, joined by an avenue to a smaller circle known as the Observatory Circle. Together, the Octagon and its circle are the part that holds the secret, and the geometry that connects them is not casual. The 4 corners of the octagon, taken the right way, form a square whose sides match the diameter of the circle, and the whole design is built on a repeated unit of measurement, a single length used again and again across the site, so that circle, square, and octagon are all bound together in exact proportion. These were people who could survey and lay out precise geometry on the ground at an enormous scale, and who cared enough to do it. So the physical facts, before we even reach the moon, are already staggering. The largest geometric earthworks in the world, built by hand 2,000 years ago, laid out with a consistent unit of measure and precise proportions, by a people trading across the whole continent. All of that is checkable, mapped, and still partly standing in an Ohio town. And then, in the 1980s, 2 researchers noticed what the earthworks were pointing at. If you enjoy slow documentaries that take a quiet, grassy field and reveal the astronomy hidden in it, consider subscribing, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because when Ray Hively and Robert Horn set out to survey the octagon, they expected to find alignments to the sun, and instead they found the moon. Ray Hively, a physicist, and Robert Horn, a philosopher, both at Earlham College, carried out a careful survey of the Newark Earthworks and published their results in 1982. They went in as skeptics, aware of how easy it is to imagine alignments that are not really there, and they tested their findings hard. What they found is that the octagon and its observatory circle are aligned not to the sun, but to the moon, and specifically to the most difficult lunar cycle there is. The sun's yearly journey is simple to follow. The moon is far harder because, on top of its monthly phases, The points on the horizon where it rises and sets swing back and forth through a much slower cycle that takes about 18 and a half years to complete. Over that long cycle, the moon reaches its extreme northern and southern rising and setting points, the lunar standstills, and then returns. To notice that cycle at all, let alone to pin down its limits, you have to watch the moon carefully for the better part of 2 decades. Hively and Horn found that the main axis of the octagon, the line running through it and its circle, points to the rising of the moon at its northernmost extreme, the maximum standstill, and that other walls and openings of the octagon mark the rest of the moon's extreme rising and setting points around the whole cycle. The entire giant structure, in other words, is a diagram of the 18 and a half years swing of the moon, drawn in earthen walls 1,000 feet across. To feel how remarkable that is, imagine the task. There is no single night when the moon announces its limits. To find them, you have to watch it rise and set, month after month, year after year, marking the furthest north and furthest south it reaches. And only after most of 2 decades of patient observation does the full pattern reveal itself and begin to repeat. That knowledge cannot be gathered by one person in one season. It has to be built up across many years, very possibly handed from older watchers to younger ones, and only then can it be laid into the ground. And when it was laid into the ground here, it was done at a scale meant to be walked. Stand in the Observatory Circle and look down the avenue into the octagon, and on the right nights of the cycle, the moon would rise exactly along that axis, framed by the earthen walls, the sky and the earth brought into a single line. That is a breathtaking thing to build, and it is exactly the kind of claim an honest documentary has to test, rather than simply admire. So here's the hard question, asked fairly. Is the lunar alignment real and intended, or is it a pattern we have laid over a big structure with many walls? This is the right skepticism, because a figure as large as the octagon has many edges and openings, and the sky has many events, so coincidental alignments are always a danger. But the lunar case at Newark is unusually strong, and it is worth understanding why. Hively and Horn were not looking for the moon and did not want to find it, which makes their conclusion harder to wave away as wishful thinking. The alignments they found are not a single lucky line, but a consistent set. Several independent features of the octagon pointing to several different extreme positions of the moon, all belonging to the same coherent cycle. And the precision is high, close enough that the odds of the whole pattern arising by chance are very low. For those reasons, the octagon's lunar alignment is regarded by many specialists as one of the best supported claims in all of archaeoastronomy, far firmer than the scattered and doubtful alignments that plague lesser sites. It is not certain in the way a written record would be, and honest researchers still probe it, but it holds up remarkably well. The people of Newark appear to have genuinely encoded the long cycle of the moon into the earth. And that forces a second question, one that is less about astronomy and more about how this history has been told. Because for a long time, the honest answer to who built the earthworks was buried under a lie. This is the point where the format's usual third strand, a living oral tradition that points to the same thing, is thin, and it is important to say so plainly rather than invent one. There is no single unbroken oral account from a named nation that explains the Newark earthworks in detail. And the reason for that gap is itself part of the story. It is not that the builders were mysterious strangers, it is that their descendants were driven out. In the 1800s, as settlers spread across Ohio, a popular and convenient myth took hold. The idea that the great mounds and earthworks had been built by some vanished superior race, old world voyagers, or a lost civilization, anyone but the ancestors of living native people. That Moundbuilder myth was not an innocent mistake. It was used to justify taking the land because if the impressive earthworks had been built by a vanished race and not by the ancestors of the native nations then living in Ohio, it was easier to argue those nations had no deep claim to the ground. Careful people did map the earthworks in that era. In the 1840s, 2 Ohio investigators named Ephraim, Squier, and Edwin Davis surveyed Newark and dozens of other sites and published detailed maps that remained valuable, and their work became the first great publication of the new Smithsonian institution. But the lost race idea clung on for decades in the popular mind. It was finally demolished near the end of the 1800s, when a Smithsonian archaeologist named Cyrus Thomas carried out a huge survey of the mounds and concluded, plainly and correctly, that they had been built by the ancestors of the American Indians and by no one else. And at the same time that the myth was doing its work, the native peoples of Ohio, the Shawnee, the Miami, and others were being forcibly removed from the state, marched west to Oklahoma and elsewhere, cut off from the very landscape their ancestors had shaped. So the thinness of the oral thread at Newark is not evidence that the builders vanished. It is the direct result of a deliberate removal and a deliberate myth, and modern archaeology has thoroughly demolished the lost race idea. The earthworks were built by native people, The ancestors of nations who are still here and saying so clearly is part of telling this story truthfully. What we can say about their purpose, even without a detailed text, is that a place like this was almost certainly not a fortress or a town, but a ceremonial center, a gathering place on an enormous scale, very possibly a destination of pilgrimage where scattered communities came together at appointed times. The moon woven into its geometry suggests that those times were set by the sky, that people traveled to Newark to mark the great turning points of the lunar cycle together. Archaeologists and descendant nations now work to understand the site in partnership rather than treating it as a puzzle owned by outsiders. And that shift, from studying a vanished race to listening to living peoples, is quietly changing how the whole story is told. None of the deepest questions here are fully closed. We cannot name the specific communities who laid out the octagon, we cannot fully recover what the moon meant to them, and we cannot hear their own account in their own words. But we can separate the solid ground from the open questions. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. At Newark, Ohio, stand the surviving pieces of the largest geometric earthworks in the world, a great circle and a linked octagon, built by the Hopewell about 2,000 years ago with precise geometry and a consistent unit of measure. Ray Hively and Robert Horn showed in 1982 that the octagon is aligned to the extreme risings and settings of the moon across its 18-and-a-half-year cycle, an alignment that holds up as one of the strongest in the field. The builders were native people, ancestors of living nations, and the old idea of a vanished race is false, and the direct oral memory is thin, largely because Ohio's native peoples were removed from the land. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know exactly which communities built Newark, or how they organized the enormous labor, or how they carried the knowledge of the moon's long cycle across the generations it takes to learn it. We do not fully know what ceremonies filled these enclosures, or why the moon, rather than the sun, was chosen as the great measure here. And we can never fully undo the erasure, the removal, and the myth that severed so many people from this place. But the recovery has begun. For over a century, remarkably, much of the octagon lay beneath a private golf course, its ancient walls serving as hazards on the fairways, open to the public only a few days a year. A country club leased the octagon beginning around 1910 and laid an 18-hole golf course over it, so that for generation after generation, the ancient walls, aligned to the moon, served as bunkers and boundaries on a private course, with the public allowed in only a handful of days each year. Fixing that took a long and difficult legal fight, carried all the way through the courts. But in recent years, the land has finally been returned to public stewardship so that the earthworks can be cared for and studied and understood as what they are. And in 2023, the Newark Earthworks, together with other Hopewell sites in Ohio, were named a World Heritage Site, placed on the same list as Stonehenge and the pyramids of Egypt. That recognition was won with the direct help of descendant nations, including the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Potawatomi, whose removed ancestors once shaped this land and who came back to the effort to see their heritage honored at last. For nations cut off from Ohio for nearly 2 centuries, helping to win the world's recognition for their ancestors' masterpiece is its own kind of homecoming, a reconnection of a people and a place that a myth and a removal had tried to sever. History is rarely settled by a single site, and some of it has to be recovered from under a century of golf and 2 centuries of myth before it can be read at all. It is assembled slowly, one careful survey, one corrected lie, one returned acre at a time, and sometimes the most important work is simply to give a great achievement back to the people it belongs to. The Newark Earthworks sit in that space. The geometry real, the moon real, the builders native and their descendants still here. The walls were raised by hand, the moon is written in them, the people were never a lost race. Thank you for standing on the old walls with me. If you would like more of these, the kind that clear away a myth to reveal the real makers, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When a people watch the moon for a lifetime, build its longest cycle into the earth on a scale you can only see from the sky, and are then written out of their own achievement, what does it take, and what does it mean to finally give it back to them?